quickly and drop it down in. It's running down my elbow. Hello, welcome back to Sage and Stone Homestead. My name is Heather. This is going to be a cheese making video. We are at the time of year where we are in transition from our protein centric harvest into the garden harvest, or the vegetable and fruit harvest. So this is a really busy time, and we're having a processing day tomorrow for animals. We're processing a few goats and some rabbits, and I need to clear my dairy fridge so we can fill it with meat. So that's where the cheese making comes in. But I have a very exciting thing to go pick up in just a few minutes, and I wanted to bring you with me because it's a big deal. I can't believe it. Okay, so this is smaller than I thought it was.
But they got leash on them already.
They do have leashes?
Yeah.
Okay. Hi, baby.
Yeah, giant goats.
She's like, yeah.
Yeah, let's go.
Woo!
There you go. Okay.
Oh, I know. She's like, not again. Alright, you holding there, Molly? Hold her tight like that. You can let her go in a second. Watch your face, little girl. Big girl. We did it! Yay, thank you. Hi, can you say hi to everyone? This is Elsa. Elsa was just essentially just given to me by the same family that gave us Clover when Calamity died. Clover and Elsa share a sire, and Elsa is in milk, so we need to milk her. Come on, ma'am. Good girl. So Elsa, Miss Elsa, look at Fury trying to steal her food. She makes well over a gallon of milk every day when she's milked twice a day. And I have been milking her twice a day just to keep her in that same routine. The reason that she needed to be sold, she's 3 years old, and the 3 times that she's kidded, her babies have been well over 9 pounds, like in between 9 and 12 pounds each, even when she has multiples, and that's pretty rough on her. So the woman that essentially gave her to me only breeds standard, and so she wanted Elsa to go to a home that breeds to Nigerians so that she can have smaller babies, easier kiddings, and she's here with us. Usually when I make cheese, I wait until I have about 7 gallons. Ideally, you should be using the freshest milk possible so that the cultures that are in the milk don't interfere with the cultures that we're going to add for our Colby. I have used milk that is close to 2 weeks old with success. Just know that it does come with some risk. What I am making today is a raw milk Colby. In order to kill off some of the bacteria and things, the natural cultures that are in raw milk, you can choose to pasteurize your milk. I just think that it lends to a more bland flavor that I don't exactly love. I really like the flavor that the raw milk brings. Because I'm mainly just needing to clean out this freezer, I'm not waiting to get about 7 gallons worth. So we're gonna do a half batch today. This is 3.5 gallons. This big old pot here that I have is an 8-gallon vessel. It's 8 gallons to the tippy top. The next smallest pot that I have only fits 2 gallons, so I need the big one, unfortunately, but it'll work. Make a mess or it doesn't count. I was just trying to show you the beautiful milk coming out of the jar. Made a mess. I think the oldest milk in this batch is only from the 10th, which was 2 days ago. We have been feeding a couple bottle babies. We've been using milk as we regularly do. And so this is just the excess from a couple days. And that goat that we just bought, Elsa, she's gonna add about 1 gallon to 1.5 gallons to that load every day. What I normally do is I will save up the milk from the week. Sometimes I'll save it up for up to 2 weeks, and every other time I process milk, I will do what I'm doing today. I'll make a Colby cheese, and then every other week I'll actually cream separate the milk and make butter. I have quite a few videos on making butter, but none on making the Colby, so here we are. So the first thing that we're gonna do is add all the milk to the pot, and I need to bring this up only to 86 degrees. And that's the temperature that that culture is going to be able to reproduce and inoculate the milk best at. I do have this thermometer here that I like to use. A lot of thermometers that you can find for the kitchen don't read below 100 degrees. So if you are looking for a kitchen thermometer, make sure you get one that reads pretty low. So we've got the little probe here. Just gonna stick that down in the milk. I like to secure it with a clothespin so it just doesn't fall in. There's a thermometer, all the lovely milk. The pot that I'm using is a heavy bottomed pot. This one is stainless steel. When you're making things with milk, when you're acidifying milk, like is gonna happen naturally here with lactic acid, you wanna make sure that you're using a vessel that's non-reactive, something that's not going to be affected when you add in any kind of vinegar or a higher acid environment. I will say that I am not one to necessarily sterilize the utensils that I'm using to make my cheeses. You can. There's not going to be anything wrong with doing so, just to be triple sure that everything is super duper clean. I just make sure that everything is as clean as it would be if I was to cook dinner for my family, and it tends to work out pretty well. The only thing that I do worry about sterilizing is my hand and my arm, and we'll get to that in a future step. The recipe that I'm using is originally from the New England Cheesemaking Company. I have written it down on a note card here. I believe the original recipe is for using or culturing 2 gallons worth of milk, but you can scale that up or down. I'm just using my clean cheese ladle here to stir the milk just so it heats evenly. Like I said, we're going to be heating this milk up to 86. I'm watching the thermometer over here, and I'm going to actually turn my burner off probably about 84, and the residual heat in the pot itself will bring it up to temp. I will say too, if you happen to go a little bit over, like into low 90s, for my cheese culture, that hasn't killed it. So don't worry about being exactly at 86. Roundabouts is going to be just fine. I want to mention too that before we even went to go get Elsa, I did put about a gallon's worth of filtered water in the refrigerator, and that's going to be important for later. Okay, we are up to temp now, and now we need to add our culture. So the recipe calls for 1/4 teaspoon of a mesophilic culture per 2 gallons of milk. So cheese making has a lot of kind of complicated terms, especially when it comes to cultures. There's a bunch of different ways that you can culture your milk for a bunch of different cheeses. This is the one that calls for cheddars and actually a lot of different types of cheeses. This is an MA11. This is not actually the one that I'm going to be using today, but this is one that you can find very readily that works very well. We're using this farmhouse cheddar culture that we can get locally. This is the Miller's Natural Foods farmhouse cheddar culture. It's what they sell at our Amish store. They ship it in from Pennsylvania. We like the flavor that this cheese lends, or this culture. So because I'm doing 3.5 gallons, I'm going to do just less than a half teaspoon of culture. So see, it's just a powdered culture like this. And I'm just going to sprinkle it over the top of the milk, and I'm going to let this rehydrate for just a couple minutes before I stir it in. I have decided to move the pot off of the heat because after my beeper went off, it did heat up to temp, but then it got to 90, and I don't exactly want it climbing. As I mentioned, it's not the big deal if it does climb, but removing it from the heat is not a bad idea. And I'm just going to take my cheese ladle and stir that culture in. So this is one of the many points at which we wait. We need to let this culture proliferate inside of the milk and do its thing. And so I'm gonna put the lid on this and come back in an hour. I like to make cheese on days where I need to clean the kitchen. I don't know if you've noticed, but I need to do that because I can be around to kind of babysit the temperature, babysit the pot, but also get some necessary work done. All right, so it's been an hour, and we're at the part of the process where we're actually going to color the cheese. So my children really require the cheese to be yellow. I can make the same cheese and it won't be yellow. I don't use the annatto, and they will not eat it. They think it tastes different. This actually doesn't change the flavor at all. It's all a mind game, but you don't need very much in order to get a yellow coloring. So my recipe says 3/4 teaspoon for a 6-gallon batch. So I'm gonna do about a 1/4 teaspoon and a 1/2 quarter. See what it looks like when you drop it down in. Now this, it looks pretty light. as it's, you know, just colored the milk a very light yellow color. As we make our cheese and the curds separate from the whey, the curds are going to be what hangs on to most of that coloring, and our cheese will be nice and yellow-orange. Now that the cheese is all colored, it's time to add the rennet. And rennet is a coagulating agent. We actually buy kid rennet. It comes from the stomachs of baby goats. I bought this because I figured if it comes from a goat, it's probably going to be pretty good at coagulating goat's milk. It's a half a teaspoon per 2 gallons, and we actually need to dilute this into a little bit of water. So I've got some water down here. Half teaspoon per 2 gallons. So we're going to put half teaspoon there, and then a half of this spoon. This part is a little bit hard to show you and also put the camera into the pot here. So what I'm doing is I'm gonna pour the rennet solution over my spoon, and it's just gonna help disperse the rennet through the milk a little bit more thoroughly, and we need to stir this in. I have heard all kinds of different theories about different ways that you should stir in rennet to not break the surface of the milk, blah, blah, blah. I don't know. I don't worry about it too much. We just want to make sure that it's incorporated throughout, and then we're going to leave it alone. So during that hour that we let the milk sit and for the culture to work, we still maintain 90 degrees temperature. So we still are at 90. I'm just going to leave it as it is, and the rennet mixture needs to sit for 45 minutes. Okie dokie. We are back, and looks like our cheese, our curds are ready to cut. And here are our curds. There's a little bit of annatto that bled down from the edge of the pot, but it still looks like milk in here. And I mean, it is technically, but we have a clean break. See that? We can cut into the curd, and there's like a clear way in between the separation there. This is how we know our curd is set, it's ready to cut. So this specific recipe wants us to cut the curd in 1/2-inch cubes. You are not going to get even close to having every single curd being that size. We will worry about that later. We're just gonna do the best we can. So I'm gonna take out my thermometer here, which honestly, if your curd does cool down below 86 during this process, it is okay. We are gonna reheat things and cook the curd in just a minute, but first we need to cut it. You can use a regular knife to cut the curd. The reason that I like this is when I'm doing the big giant batches, this does get all the way down to the bottom of the pot, while my biggest knife out of my knife block does not reach. So first thing we're gonna do is actually cut a grid pattern in the curd. So I'm gonna go down and about every 1/2 inch, cut the curd this direction. Okay, now that I've cut the curd this direction, I'm going to go the opposite way. We're making a grid pattern. So now we have the curds cut in a way where they're basically like giant skyscrapers. I've only cut them this way and that way. I need the curd to also be cut on the horizontal plane, and that's where a cheese ladle comes in handy. So I'm just gonna be scooping it throughout the pot here, going a little bit lower and lower with each scoop, trying to get about a 1/2 inch square. Again, we are not going to be getting this perfect. We're just gonna do the best we can. Can you see what we're getting? Now comes the part of the process which is really the fun part. It's the part where we stand here and cook the curds for about an hour. So I need to move the pot back onto the heat. I need to find something interesting to look at or listen to on YouTube or a podcast. There are a couple different ways in which you can stir the curd. A lot of people will use their cheese ladle, and as we're stirring, I am going to be cutting in some of the larger curds back down to size. I have found that I personally really like to stir the curd with my hands. I can feel what's going on. I can tell how well the curds are cooking, but in order to keep everything as clean as possible, the best thing for me to do is wash my hands, which I've already done, but then I'm gonna douse my whole arm in vinegar. So this is a working farm, so I am doing all kinds of things. Actually, during that 45-minute curd set, I went and just butted a couple of baby goats and fed some animal crackers out to the goats. So my hands, you know, they're just dirty. Hands are. So I'm gonna roll my sleeve up. This is quite a large shirt. I love it, clearly. I'm just gonna take this apple cider vinegar. It could be, you know, regular vinegar too. You see what I'm doing? If you have any cuts on your arms, you're gonna find them. There, just like that. I'm not gonna wipe it off. I'm just gonna drip dry a little bit here. And now my hand is good to go. A little bit on fire. Like how many little cuts do I have? Whew, it's worth it. It's not bad, really. I'm being dramatic. So the recipe says to cook the curds to 102 degrees over the course of 30 minutes. With my stove, I can put the curd back on and put it to a medium. Right at a 5 will work out well, and the timing does great with that. We get from about 90 or 88 up to 102 in about half an hour. There are sciencey reasons as to why you need to slowly cook the curds. I believe the lactic acid is starting to develop. You don't want to rush this. But as I'm stirring, see, this is kind of a large curd right here. I'm just gonna take my thumb and separate any of the bigger curds that I come across down to size, about a 1/2 inch cube. You may notice while stirring the curd that you have some curds that are smaller than the 1/2 inch. I wouldn't worry about it. This is not going to be an exact science. Cheese really isn't like that. It's an art, and like many art forms, there are many different variations. And that's the beauty of it. But we're gonna try to do what we can to get about a 1/2 inch curd on all of these. And I am gonna be stirring constantly so that we're heating and cooking the curds evenly throughout. So as I showed you, these curds are quite wet. It's like a really soupy, sloppy kind of jello, almost like a custard. The curds are very delicate and they're falling apart quite easily. This is going to change as we cook. All right, so it's actually only been 23 minutes and I am up to temperature. And I want to stress again here that things do not have to be exact. You want to try to get as close to following the rules in the recipe as really possible, but don't stress about it. If you get to temp a little early, that's fine. Ultimately, we want to be cooking the curds for a full hour. We did come up to temp a little bit early, but I am going to be cooking these curds down because I need them to get to the right consistency. So you can probably see that our texture is really different and the size of the curds is much smaller than it was when we started. See that? So you start out with like a 1/2 inch curd and you wind up cooking the curds down and they shrink. So see this big one here? I'm going to try to show you what the consistency that we're looking for in a fully cooked curd. So I'm not going to have the fully cooked curd right now, but you can see this undercooked curd. So it's a little fat, which is one of the reasons that it's undercooked. It does have this like skin around the outside and you can feel that. It's one of the reasons I like to use my hands when making cheese. It's got a little bit of a tougher skin, but when I open it, it's still very juicy and sloppy on the inside. So the texture on the outside of the curd is different than the texture on the inside of the curd. And when my curds are fully cooked, they're going to be the same texture throughout. So I'm going to keep listening to Rachel over at 1870s Homestead and her gardening tips. I shut the stove off because I am at 102 degrees. The residual heat in the pot is probably going to maintain that. If it doesn't, I'm not going to worry too much about it unless it gets maybe under 100. And I'm just going to keep stirring. I don't want the curds to stick to the bottom or stick together quite yet. We're just trying to cook them down and develop an acid. Okay, now we are at the part of the process that I talked about earlier called washing the curd. The curd, let me show you where we're at right now with it. So this is what we've got. It's running down my elbow. But the curd is a relatively uniform size, and when I squeeze it, it does stick together. But most importantly, the curds are fully cooked. So we can open it up. And there's a little bit of whey coming out of that curd. This curd was a little bit fatter than some of the other ones that are in here. Here we go. This one is a little bit flatter. They have a pretty consistent texture from the outside through the inside. One of the things about this curd washing process and washing the curd with water, we're going to be removing the whey and replacing it with water. From what I hear, that helps lock in moisture inside of the curd and helps give you like a smoother, creamier texture. And washing the curd will help remove that lactic acid or stop its formation, resulting in a sweeter cheese. So if we ignored this part of the process and just started to salt and press the cheese right now, we would probably end up with a cheese that was a lot more acid tasting and more crumbly. And we don't want that. We want something that's gonna slice and something that's gonna be creamy and lovely and melty. So let's wash these curds. What I need to do is let the curd, stop stirring it, and let the curd settle down to the bottom. So I'm just gonna give it a little bit so we can do that. I have this lovely measuring cup that I'm going to use just to dip the whey from the top of the curd. So we have a curd mat at the bottom of the pot here, and I'm just going to be taking the whey off of the top of that curd mat. And once I start to see curds down below here, we'll add some water. This whey is lovely and has many uses. This is a sweet whey as opposed to like a vinegar whey. There are many, many uses for whey. As I mentioned, the things that I have the time for this time of year is feeding it to my chickens and adding it to my compost. So that's what I've been doing. Dipping out the whey. The curds are submerged. You can't even see them yet. See, we've removed a lot of whey and we can see the top of the curd surface. And now we need to add water. So for this first curd washing, I'm gonna add room temperature water. Put my thermometer back in here so I can tell where we're at. Okay, curds are at 95 degrees, right? Ooh, 97 degrees, 99. Okay, I think they've settled out at 99. Curds are 99 degrees. So we've got some cooling to do. That was about a gallon's worth of room temperature filtered water, and I'm just gonna stir these curds around, help them cool off a little. Some of them have stuck together. This is fine. I'm just gonna break them up with my hand. Okay, that cooled the curd to about 86. Our goal is gonna be 75. So what I need to do now is let the curd settle again and do the same process. I'm gonna dip off the whey water mixture until I start to see the top of the curds again. And this time I'm gonna add the refrigerated water. So that will do the trick in getting us down to the target temp. You could, and I've done it before, put in ice packs and things that you've washed with vinegar to get the temperature down. But it's more than just the temperature that you're trying to get down. You are trying to literally take the whey out and dilute it with water to help achieve the final result of a nice, creamy, stretchy, melty cheese. You still get a good cheese when you add an ice pack, but the act of actively replacing the whey with water really does a lot for it. Okay, you can see the top of the curd surface again. Now it's time to add the cooler water. I am going to be a little bit careful with how much water I put in at this point. I would guess, and I've never tested this, but logically I think that if I cooled the curd down too much, that it may have a hard time sticking together when we put it in the cheese press later. So try to aim for 75 and maybe not too much cooler than that. So this water is quite cold. Ooh, yeah. My thermometer actually says 77. As I stir, it bounces around between 77 and 75. So I'm gonna call that good. And we need to strain this water whey mixture out of the curd at this point. And I like to direct salt my cheese. So I'll walk you through that. This here is butter muslin. You want butter muslin instead of cheesecloth. I promise. It is going to do the same thing. It just has a nice fine weave or a tighter weave. And I like this so much more. It does not stick. The curds do not go through. I am gonna wet it in this whey mixture just to help ensure that my curds don't stick. These are lovely washed curds. There's a couple different ways to salt your cheese. There's direct salting, which I'm gonna do now, which I feel like is the easiest. And there's also brining. Brining is a little bit of an art, like everything cheese making. It's just a titch complicated for me. Maintaining my brine is also something that's a little bit above my head. So direct salting is what I prefer. And I salt my cheese at 2% of the curd weight. So I've got my plate on my scale. I've zeroed it out. I've given the curd mass here a slight squeeze, but it's still quite wet. I'm not going to worry about that. And it's 91 ounces. So let's do some math. I need just under 2 ounces of salt. So all of this is going to go straight back into my pot. This is just sea salt here. Here's our curd. Just going to add the salt in and mix it up with my hands. Cheese doesn't have to be so hands-on like this, like with your actual hands, but I prefer it. I feel like I can be so much more thorough by using my hands. Now that the salt is all mixed in, this is what our curd is looking like. These curds are pretty small compared to what I normally work with, so it'll be kind of cool to see how this turns out. At this point, my mouth is watering. It smells really good, but there's still a lot of development to be had in the cheese. That's why we have the aging process. It's still really good, and it's really hard not to just eat handfuls of this. So I have this cheese press. I really like it. I bought this from the New England Cheesemaking Company, and a cheese press is not expressly necessary to make hard cheeses, but it makes things a little bit more exact when it comes to this step, and in my opinion it makes life a little bit easier. So it has this tray on the bottom that is going to help divert the whey into a bowl. And I have several different sizes of cheese molds here. This one is a large. This is what I normally use when I do the 7-gallon batches of cheese. So this is going to be a little bit big for the amount of curd that we have in here, but it's going to be fine. We're just going to get a flatter round of cheese, which is good. It works. I'm going to use my same butter muslin that I used before. It does have a little hole in it, so I'm going to be mindful of that hole and try not to put that within the mold. Just going to give these a light press. Now I want to encase the butter muslin all around the cheese, so I'm just going to pull one of the corners over. See, now everything is covered. This little thing is called a follower. I'm just going to stick the follower down in. And now the cheese needs to go through a series of presses. So the first stage is 15 minutes at 10 pounds of pressure. So we've got our follower. Because the follower sits so far down in here, I sometimes need to get creative about how I stack things so that I can get a good contact with the press itself. Okay, that's gonna work. This is another one of those times where cheese making is not an exact science. There are these tally marks on my press that, you know, when they line up with this board here, it should tell you about how many pounds of pressure are being exerted by the springs. But we also need to be paying attention to the amount of whey that is draining out of the holes. So right now, we are not quite at 10 pounds. Let me push down. There we go. So that worked out. About 10 pounds of pressure has a good amount of whey coming out of the holes. My camera very much keeps getting into its own light, but can you see here how there's just this very slow stream of whey coming out of this hole here? There we go. Thank you, cheese press. Good illustration. That's what we're looking for. Especially in the first part of the pressing process, you can overpress and squeeze out too much whey. You can also overpress and essentially like lock in too much whey into the cheese. It's a little bit complicated, but if you're just paying attention to how well it's draining out of the mold, like I said, it's gonna work out. You're gonna get something edible, I promise. But you don't just wanna crank down on it. You wanna be a little bit tender with it in the first couple presses especially. So we have 10 pounds of pressure for 15 minutes. And I personally like to sit here for the first couple of presses to keep on top of the cheese press. The way that this works is as the cheese compresses, this isn't exactly going to exert weight again. So once I notice on my little tally marks here that we've lost 10 pounds of pressure because we've pushed the curd mass down, I am going to apply just a tiny bit more pressure, keep track of the waste stream. I don't have to sit here all night and do this, but I like to for the first couple of presses. In between each press, we do need to flip the cheese. This just helps it get an even press all around. So at first, things are not held together super great. See, it's round-ish, but we still have a lot of cratering on the side. This is just a very light press. I'm gonna flip this over and be very gentle. It is stronger than you think. It looks like it would just crumble apart, but it tends not to, even though it looks kind of sketchy. And we'll smooth out the muslin on the top just so we can get a nice smooth finish. And the next press is 30 minutes at 20 pounds of pressure. You can see the top of the board is at the 20. There's like a tiny little drip there. So 20 pounds, this is probably fine, but I think I can press just a tiny bit harder. So we'll just push it a little bit. There, and now we're starting to see it flow. So right now it's at about 25 pounds of pressure. So that's what I'll do for 30 minutes. It is getting darker. Can you tell it's getting later? So it's time for our next flip, and you'll see that the curd is starting to knit together. See, we've got some creases in between the curd still, but it's getting closer knit together. It smells awesome. It smells a lot like yogurt at this point. So we're gonna give it another flip. I do want the muslin to stay nice and smooth so that we get a good smooth outer surface on the cheese. And the next press is 40 pounds for 90 minutes. And this press is absolutely the point where I feel like I have to babysit it and watch it a lot less. The curd is condensing a lot slower at this point. It's gonna be a little bit harder to see because I'm losing the amount of light that is considered decent in my kitchen. But the whey is flowing out of the press a lot slower at this point. This is fine. The occasional drip out of the holes is what I'm looking for. Good morning. So it's the next day and I did not film the final flip and press of the cheese. So I flipped it again and it needed to press for 50 pounds or at 50 pounds of pressure overnight. So we are at the next day and it's time to unmold the cheese. All right, moment of truth. So remember how we were seeing the separate curds and they would have that like separation between the curds? What we're looking for is for the curds to be fully knit. We don't want any more cracks or craters. To see where the butter muslin was laying on the cheese is quite normal, but you can see how, relatively speaking, we have a very smooth surface. The curds are knit together. So at this point, what we need to do is actually let the outside of the cheese dry out a little bit. So we're gonna come out here to the shed, the climate controlled shed, in order to dry the cheese. So you can see that I have this hanging herb planter over here. This is where I'm gonna put the cheese. It's gonna cure the outside for a few days and I'm gonna flip it every 12 hours so that it dries out evenly. So inside the herb dryer, I have this tray with this bamboo mat. When you set out cheese to dry, you don't wanna put it on metal. The reaction of the metal with the cheese can make it turn like a greenish blue. I don't know, some kind of chemical reaction. So I have this bamboo mat here. I'm just gonna set this down. I'm gonna stick it in the herb drying rack just to keep bugs or anything off of it. And as I mentioned, every 12 hours for about 2 days, I am gonna flip it just so it can dry out evenly on the outside. There it is. We'll come back to it when it's good and cured on the outside. So it's been a couple days. I've flipped the cheese every 12 hours and this is what we have. So during that process of the outside drying out and curing, it will lose quite a lot of weight. I'm really excited to see how much weight we get from our cheese. This is my scaredy cat livestock guardian, who usually is not in the house, but he is right now because Levi is doing target practice outside and he doesn't like that. Go lay down. We're gonna see how much this cheese weighs. You can't have any. Okay, 3.8 pounds. So that's about what I can expect. Usually I can expect about 1 pound of cheese per gallon of milk, which I personally think is really good. I don't know if that is actually really good, but I'm extremely happy with it. You can't have any of it. No. Our cheese is not done yet. We need to let this age for 4 to 6 weeks, ideally at about 55 degrees. So I do have a wine fridge that I use, and I'll show you that in just a second. You can use a regular refrigerator to age your cheeses. The thing is, the colder temps of a household refrigerator, about 39 to 40 degrees Fahrenheit, it's just gonna age it a little bit slower, so you may need a little bit longer of a time than 4 to 6 weeks. We could eat this now, it's just not going to have the development of the flavor that we're looking for. That's what we get with the aging. So before I cut it, let me tell you what I'm doing. When we age the cheese, really air is our enemy after this point, after the outside has cured. You can do different types of rinds and wrappings for your cheese. A lot of people will wax their cheeses. I like to vacuum seal mine. So I've got my vacuum seal bags all ready to go. And I don't necessarily like to vacuum seal the entire wheel of cheese, because when I pull it out of my cheese cave in order to use it, I like to only pull out what maybe I would have bought at the grocery store for a week, so the rest of it can stay in the cheese cave and continue to age and develop and get even tastier. So even though it should age for about 4 to 6 weeks, it can totally age for longer and develop more flavor, and that's not gonna hurt it. So I've got to cut it in order to fit it into my vacuum seal bags, and when I cut it, we can see the texture that the cheese has. So a Colby cheese is what's called an open texture cheese. It will have these little irregularly shaped pockets of air in there. See that? That is okay. There are situations with cheese making where holes in the cheese like this is not a good sign. Something that's not a mechanical hole that it could indicate a contaminated cheese would be looking exactly like a bubble. Perfect spheres. Many of them that are really small. These irregularly shaped larger holes are totally what Colby's all about. It smells different. It smells less like yogurt and more like cheese at this point, but it's gonna get better as it ages. I wrote 23 on that one too. Someday I'll figure out what year it is. Let's put this in the cheese cave. Down here, we have a wine fridge that we've had for a long time. I personally don't worry about maintaining some kind of humidity in my cheese cave. I do worry a little bit about the temperature, and there's a setting for that. I'll show you that on the outside, but here's the different cheeses that I have in here. Mostly it's Colby, and we're gonna cook some of this up in a little bit and see how well it melts. This is my attempt at Parmesan style cheese. We'll see how that looks, not until October. So we're gonna stick our cheeses in here. Looks like it's about 52 degrees in there, and that works. Ideally, it's best to age Colby's and other cheddar type cheeses at about 50 to 55 degrees. So we're right on target. They do say that you should flip your cheeses over every week or so while they are aging. I do sometimes. It's probably every 2 weeks that I end up flipping the cheese over. I don't exactly know what it does, but it hasn't hurted any to do it a little bit less often. Alrighty, so here is a Colby that's been sitting in my cheese fridge at about 55 degrees for a little while, almost 2 months at this point. So this is definitely ready, and this is one of the things that I really like about Colby cheese, is that you don't have to wait several months to enjoy it. As you can see in this cheese, we do have those little holes that I was talking about. These are mechanical holes. This is wanted, or this is part of what makes Colby a Colby. It smells really good. Wow. Here's what it looks like coming out of the package. There is a little bit of whey inside of the package, which is fine. One of the things that I really hope for in my homemade cheeses is a nice cheese that's able to be sliced without falling apart, so I can use it for sandwiches. But also, it's a bonus if it can melt. And not every cheese melts well. I don't really know the science behind a cheese that melts well, but this Colby very often does. And we're gonna test that out today. I'm going to make a grilled cheese for lunch. Very nice. So we got a nice sheet. It's not crumbly. It's, ooh, well, it did kind of fall apart there. Part of that is because of the holes. Lovely, lovely flavor, creamy texture. We need to see if it melts though. Now, when I make grilled cheeses, I like them lightly toasted, and because of that, no matter what cheese I use, it does not always melt on the inside all the way through. So I like to put it in the microwave for like 20 seconds when it gets to be about that well toasted. Oh, got some bread in here for tonight. This is a crusty bread. This is a crusty bread that I like to make when I serve soup. I'm making zuppa toscana for dinner. 15 seconds in the microwave, and that looks melty to me. Actually might have been a little bit too long in the microwave. It's all like melted out of the sides. So if we had any questions of whether or not the Colby melts, it does. And because of that, it's very good in like burgers, or the cheese is really good to sprinkle on top of casseroles and things. And yeah, that is how you make Colby out of goat's milk. You can make really anything out of goat's milk that you can from cow's milk. Yes, it's true that goat's milk is naturally homogenized, so it doesn't readily separate into the cream and the milk, like with that clear separation like you see on cow's milk. But even making things like butter are totally possible. I've got videos on that, and I'll link that right here.